Now, before we head back in for more of that sentencing, I want to bring in our guest. Joining us, criminal defense attorney Jeffrey Wolf. Jeffrey, great to see you as always. Thank you so much for joining me here on the program. First and foremost, I want to talk about the victim impact statement we just heard. I always try to pick something out that sort of reaches out to me, want to know what sort of affected you. But the thing that sort of touched me was she talked about at the very beginning, closure is something that many people expect to get from these type of proceedings. And she said, when the guilty verdict came in, it didn't feel like closure. It just felt like someone had died. I just found that interesting because closure isn't always the same. They don't always get it, but they just have to move on. And she talked about really focusing on family.
Yeah, I've heard judges try to explain this to families of victims all the time, that the verdict, the sentence, none of it is going to fix anything. And victim families, I think, have a really hard time coming to grips with that no matter what happens in the courtroom, you're still going to be left with the consequences of whatever's happened to your family member, especially in a case where somebody is deceased. And I think that trying to focus on what you're going to do moving forward and how your life is going to change moving forward now that the case is out of your life, especially one that's gone on this long, is a much healthier way of thinking about things than thinking about retribution and revenge, because those things, they just live in your heart forever. And I am oftentimes trying to talk to prosecutors as a defense attorney about the punishment that my client is going to suffer is not going to actually do anything for the victim family, because it's not. And you oftentimes will hear about victim families coming forward later, whether it's in a death penalty case or, decades later while somebody's still in prison, and saying that it didn't actually fix anything. And sometimes they reconcile with the very person who's committed the crime against their family, because that is more healing than the retribution ends up being.
Exactly. That I was going to say. Sometimes they figure out that is the better way to go. It just makes you feel better. But at least for that previous witness, she said she wasn't going to give Karina Cooper not one more thought. All right, Jeff, stand by. I want to go back into court now. All right, some harsh words again there at the end of that victim impact statement. Let's bring back in our guest still with us, criminal defense attorney Jeffrey Wolf. And Jeffrey, as a defense attorney representing someone like Karina Cooper under these circumstances where life without parole is mandatory, under these circumstances, do you have a strategy going in? Is there something you're thinking? We know she is appealing, was rejected here. We'll talk about that in a minute. But what would be a strategy that you would be thinking, if any?
There really isn't a whole lot of strategy. You try to limit what you're doing in this circumstance. You let the victim family have their day. This day is about them. This day is about the deceased. And you try to limit what your client is doing and most definitely limit what your client is saying. Because if you are appealing, if you are successful on that appeal, everything is recorded and you don't want any more said by your client at this point, so that if something comes back and there's another trial, there's not some statement or allocution from your client or admission from your client that is going to then be used in another trial. You want to just let the victim family have their day. It's a really, really tough hearing as a defense attorney to sit through. It's a solemn day. You be sympathetic. You sit there, you listen to it, you let the slings and the arrows hit you, because sometimes they come for the lawyers too in these hearings. They haven't yet that we've heard, but it's a tough day and you get through it.
How do you feel about that when they do direct some of their ire at the attorneys? We had one yesterday where one of the victim impact statements really focused in on the lawyers, talking about, how could they represent someone like that who had killed their loved one. How do you feel about that? I felt like perhaps the court should step in and say, look, that's not what this day is about. Or do you think it's okay to let them go on and say what they have to say? Because again, like you said, this day is about the victims.
The court should absolutely step in, but the court rarely does. The court usually just lets people say whatever the heck they want to. Quite frankly, the court should step in when somebody's telling somebody to go to hell too. But at the end of the day, the court is going to do what the court's going to do. As an attorney, what you do is you rise above it. When they go low, you go high, as we say. And you just stay stone-faced, you stay somber, and you ignore it. You move on, and you go let your loved ones at home tell you you're a good person, because you are.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, you're just doing your job at the end of the day, which is why I even mentioned it. The last thing I want to talk about quickly, you talked a little bit about you don't want your client to speak, and we saw in this instance, Karina Cooper decided not to say something. But in light of the fact that she took the stand and proclaimed her innocence, she had an entire story. She was being manipulated, et cetera, by Houston Danker. So the judge has actually heard her at this point. I'm sure it's in his mind that she took the stand and told the jury she wasn't responsible for this crime, and we know the court likes for defendants to take responsibility. Is that a problem? And would that change your approach knowing that she took the stand?
I mean, it's not a problem in this case where the sentence is what the sentence is. If there's a sentencing range that you're working with, then yeah, you may have to get up there and you may have to start singing a different tune depending on what your client's position is. If your client's position is that they didn't do it, well, they got convicted, but that doesn't mean your client's position has changed, and not every verdict is correct. Innocent people go to prison. It happens in this country. And if we're thinking that just because somebody got convicted, it's possible that they are not innocent, we haven't been watching enough TV and we haven't been reading enough of the newspapers.
Yeah, fair enough. This was one of those cases, though, as the judge said, seemed like the great weight of evidence was for a conviction, and the jury agreed. All right, Jeff, stand by. We're going to take a break. All right, so an emotional Karina Cooper now, the property of the Iowa Department of Corrections for the rest of her life. Let's bring back in our guest, well, that's criminal defense attorney Jeffrey Wolf. Jeffrey, you saw the attorney talking to his client there. As much as you expect this, you know this is coming. It's always a difficult moment. It hits like a hammer. What's that conversation like? And when do you get to talk to her again? And what are you guys talking about? Take us behind the curtain a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, the last conversation you have with a client who is about to go to prison is a somber one. You know, it's usually brief. You usually will, tell them to keep their head up, and if there's an appeal coming, you'll tell them that, the appellate lawyer will come meet with you, or if you're the appellate lawyer, you'll tell them when you're going to come meet with them. Usually, let them know that you're going to talk to their family, and you've usually prepared them for that day. So there's not a lot to talk about in that moment other than to, try to be human to them in that moment, because not a lot of people have. And so you try to have a bit of humanity with your client, have a bit of a moment where you try to remind them that you still care, even in that darkest moment in their life.
Yeah, fair enough. Another part of that sentence, as we heard from the judge, was this $14,000 plus in restitution to the crime victims compensation board. Talk to me a little bit about that, because what's interesting about this case is initially she was considered a victim of this crime. She wasn't arrested for 3 years when they finally got enough evidence to arrest her. So I imagine she took advantage of some of what the system was offering her.
Yeah, she probably did. And so the victim compensation board in most jurisdictions is a bit nebulous of a term, because they're not necessarily collecting money back that they gave to her. Victim compensation boards are going to pay out to any victims of the crime. And so it's going to be something where the family may have had therapy or the payment of the funeral costs, anything they're out of pocket. Victim compensation boards are there to vet that money and get it to victims sooner so that they are made whole, and then to collect the money and have that money come out of the county's budget rather than coming out of the victim's pocket, and have them be out that money for an elongated period of time. Because let's face it, she's going to prison. That money is not going to get paid back anytime soon, if at all. And so the county has paid that money to the victims. They've been made whole, and now the county's budget has a line item in it that may or may not get paid back. That's essentially what it is.
And I would imagine that if she had any assets, I got about 10 seconds here, Jeff, if she had any assets or anything, they would sell those and sort of put that towards that restitution?
Yeah, exactly, because it doesn't discharge in bankruptcy. So,
all right,
yeah,
fair enough. Jeffrey Wolf, thank you so much for being with me this afternoon. Truly appreciate it. Folks, I want you to stick around. Coming up, we're going to head to another case happening out of Iowa, the machete murder plot trial of Dakota Van Patten. We'll have opening statements for you there, so keep it right here on Court TV, your front row seat to justice.